If you have higher level spellcasters in your group, there will come a time when they may need some weird material components to cast some spells. Many DMs ignore the flavor of material components, but there are lots of ways to make the material components a fun and interesting part of your game. Where do players find unusual materials? How rare are they? Can you make your own material components? Today we're going to look at some ways to answer these questions. The core rulebooks describe the general uses for material components as a part of each spell that requires them. Beyond the listing of the ingredient itself, there's not a whole lot of extra information. The basic gist is that there are items used to cast spells. When the spell is cast, it may or may not consume the components as indicated in the spell description. Some components are listed with no prices, as their cost and value is assumed to be negligible. Other spell components are given list prices in the book. These are minimums for the cost of a component, and the items must be specifically obtained. This seems like a lot to consider, which is precisely why so many DMs ignore material components. The easiest way to ignore them is by making the assumption that your spellcasters have a material components pouch with all the necessary items. Most spells don't consume or require crazy components, and the player's handbook doesn't say how the components are used. It's never spelled out that the caster needs to produce them or hold them in a certain way, just that they have to be present for the spell. This system has advantages and disadvantages. It simplifies spells for combat primarily, but it also takes away from some of the flavor and description that goes along with the use of material components in the first place. If you want to make material components more fun, you might insist that players keep track of what's in their pouch. This is a bit of extra work for your players, but it also makes for an interesting ruling as a DM. Does a player have to find the material components during a session? We would argue that some common material components might not be so common in other regions or areas, and the effort to seek them out makes the spells more worthwhile. Let's look at some common material components and discuss how they might be found or used. Here's a quick list of common material components. A bit of bat fur, phosphorus, coal, grave dirt, yew leaves, powdered metals, gemstones, and a copper piece. These common material components should not be too hard to come across in normal campaigns, but a few of them might be a bit harder to find. It's entirely possible to be in a region without bats, and bat fur might come at a premium. Additionally, yew leaves are not known to grow in all environments, and people might not take kindly to strangers absconding with grave dirt. The act of ruling that your players need to procure specific items can make a spell seem more weighty and might encourage side quests to get materials they need. This is even better when players will be using them for spells where they're not consumed, as it feels like they have unlocked the spell as a reward for their troubles. So if you make your party find their own material components, how do they get them? Well, it could be from all types of places. Let's take a look at a few examples. The first and most obvious answer is that players might try to purchase material components. They could buy a standard material components pouch that is pre-stocked with items, or they might have to hunt for rarer materials in any given region. Even if a component has no listed price, it obviously has some value, and other spellcasters would charge them for it. If you're in a small town without other spellcasters, people simply might not have weirder material components available. Bat fur isn't something that a town would seek out or maybe even save, so you might be out of luck if you need it to cast a spell. Conversely, a small town might be suffering from a bat infestation, and it would be a simple side quest to both take care of the bats and retrieve material components. When a player can't buy what they want, a shopkeeper may instead tell them where they can find the items they need. Let's say a wizard needs some coal. The town might only use charcoal, which might not work out for our caster. The shopkeeper could then point the party to an abandoned mine outside of the town where they could procure some coal, and perhaps even come across other adventures while they explore. This leads the party into a side quest, and later could unlock a handful of spells for our wizard. It might not be reasonable to find the exact material component that a player needs to cast their spell. At this point, we would recommend, especially for wizards, that you offer them the chance to try and research a substitute component for the spell. This is completely homebrew, but makes sense within the context of the rules that are set out in the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons spellcasting. If you can't find yew leaves around, maybe another leaf would work. Does the power come from what the use symbolizes, or is it an innate property of the plant? Your player could test this, and you can even have them roll Arcana, History, Medicine, or Investigation checks when searching for a substitute. If they're trying something else in mid-combat, have them roll to see if the spell succeeds. If it does, maybe the effect is slightly different. You could have the substitute component make the spell more potent, but the component is now consumed. Perhaps the new component always has a failure chance. There's a lot you can do with this idea, and opening it up to your players can make your magic feel a lot more adaptive and fun. Some spells need some really odd stuff. Let's take a look at a few crazy material components and think about the ways to acquire and use them. Some uncommon material components could be a sacrificial offering worth 25 gold pieces, a writing quill plucked from a sleeping bird, a piece of tentacle from a squid or octopus, a piece of ivory worth 100 gold pieces, rare incense, powdered ruby worth 1,000 gold pieces, and an undead eyeball encased in a gem worth 150 gold pieces. Okay, some of these are really weird. I mean, where do you even get an undead eyeball encased in a gem? The fact that the eye must belong to an undead creature in the first place already makes this a hard thing to come by. And how and why would someone encase it in a gem? Your guess is as good as ours, but it's important to note that these things are not unattainable, and your players shouldn't be punished for picking spells with weird components. Players might not be able to buy what they need, but nothing prevents them from crafting something on their own. Already have an undead creature's eye? Well then shatter a gem and cast Mending or Fabricate to make the gem reform around it. Does that even work? Sure, why not? It's not always your job to tell your players how to make a thing they need, just your responsibility to ask them if they want to try to do so. They'll likely have ideas of their own, and that's what makes material components fun. If you do have your players keep track of material components, don't make it difficult. The point is to have fun by adding some flavor to the game, not to make things less fun by forcing people to calculate things and constantly refer to sheets. It's the same thing with carrying capacity. Calculating out your weight every time you pick something up just isn't fun for most people, especially a weak spellcaster who can hardly lift a spellbook, let alone some loot. When using material components more actively in your game, be sure your players are engaging with that content. If they don't find side quests to gather components fun, run them less often. If they don't want to go through the trouble of getting weird components, you can instead make them loot items in dungeons or drops from enemy spellcasters. Material components don't have to be looked at as an all-or-nothing set of rules where it's either easy or hard for the player. A middle ground is possible. Some difficulty can make the spells and their use more rewarding and add depth to your game. Consider tackling material components with your players in your next session. The results might surprise you. If you're interested in more ideas, check out our other videos. You can find more resources at masterthedungeon.com. If you liked this video, channel your inner barbarian and smash that bell, and support us on Patreon. Happy DMing!